What's the problem?
So, this is Stephen Palmer, and I am with Martha Shelley at her home in Portland, Oregon. And David and I just arrived by plane an hour ago and rented a car at Dollar Rent a Car, made our way over here. And now we're about to interview for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Martha, how about taking 5 minutes or so and just giving a sense of your childhood, family, rearing, religion,
Sure.
and then we'll bring it into sexual awareness.
Okay. I was born in 1943 in Brooklyn. My family was mixed in terms of observance. My grandparents were Orthodox Jews, my mother's parents. My father's parents weren't particularly observant. And I was raised with both families, but basically steeped in cultural Judaism with some observances.
Mm-hmm.
And what else would you like to know about my early childhood?
Were you bat mitzvahed?
No, I was not.
Okay.
Grew up in Brooklyn, and then went to Bronx High School of Science. Left home when I was essentially when I was 19. At that point, I already knew that I was gay. But before that, I already knew that I was different. I think from pretty early on, the one memory that sticks out was when we were doing drawings in elementary school, and the little boys would all draw pictures of planes shooting, aircraft guns, submarines, things like that. The girls would draw pictures that were supposedly of themselves in wedding dresses, and they all looked exactly alike, these bell-shaped skirts and like little points for fingers and toes, and heart-shaped with low cleavage, I guess, tops. And it was all very, very stereotypical. I would draw pictures of undersea scenes or desert scenes with cactuses, something different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I knew that I was not like either of those groups.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in middle school, what they now call middle school, but what we used to call junior high school, I started being politically rebellious. And I don't know why that was. I think I must have absorbed it somehow from my family, because during the McCarthy period they weren't exactly talking about all of it. But I understand from one of my uncles that my father was pretty radical during the Depression. And my mother would tell me things like never cross a picket line, which was definitely a left-wing thing. I remember at one point, this was kind of silly, kids were bringing water pistols and having water pistol fights in the schoolyard. And then the teachers sent around a note that everybody was supposed to sign saying that they understood that they were not allowed to bring water pistols to the school. Well, I confused that in my young head with loyalty oaths. I said, I never brought a water pistol to school, I never intend to, and I'm not going to sign this thing. They dragged me down to the principal's office and threatened to call my parents, and finally I gave in, and I was ashamed of having given in, but I have not forgiven them to this day.
That political rebelliousness, you said that you were told that your father was radical during the Depression. Was that your sense of him as well during the 40s and 50s?
No, not at all. Nor my mother, nor anybody else. It was just, I heard that much later on from other relatives. But by the time that I was old enough to understand even what was going on, all they were doing was just raising their kids and trying to stay afloat economically, and they were not well off. my father worked as a clerk for the federal government, like I think it was a grade 4 clerk. And that was, he said always that he was on the edge whenever they gave out statistics about middle class versus poor. He was always on the marginal line between middle class and poor, and we never seemed to get beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It sounds like, though his radical days may have been a bit anemic by the time you were growing up, it was still, there was some osmosis happening where you were picking up these one-liners and a sense of rebelliousness.
Something, yeah. My mother, when Castro got into power, she said to me, and I'll quote pretty close to what she said, that she approved of Castro, although she wasn't a communist, because she had grown up in Havana. Her family had left Poland, I think it was 1921, and though they were the only ones who survived, that part of the family that came to the United States. Well, they came to Cuba because they couldn't get into the United States. There was an immigration quota. My mother came to the United States as an illegal immigrant. I think it was in the late 30s. Maybe it was, no, she was 16, so it must have been 1930. The Depression was on. She came in, she went to work in a factory, and then eventually met my father, married him, and became legal. But what she said about Castro was that when she was a kid, she didn't have enough to eat. They were very poor. She didn't get an education. They had to take her out of school and put her to work in a factory. And she said that at least the children in Cuba will now be able to all go to school, and they'll all get enough to eat.
That's a very different message than anything I heard some years later, so I get it. So that was still there. Brothers and sisters?
My sister, who was 3 years younger than me, and my cousin, who was kind of adopted by my family and raised as a brother, and he's 5 years younger than me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was schooling like for you? Friends and that world? You recognized that you were different. How did that affect you in school or with friends?
It didn't really start to affect me that much until high school. In middle school, however, my best friend was the daughter of the middle school math teacher. And they were from Jamaica, and they were black. And I loved her. I didn't understand what that meant. But I remember one day when we had to go to different classes because she couldn't be in the same math class with her mother teaching there, she just leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. And it was like, I didn't want to wash that cheek. That burned for the rest of the day. Mm. Or she would come over to our house and we'd sit and watch TV and hold hands. And I don't know whatever happened to her. I wish I knew where she was these days. But the feeling that I had for her, if I had been a few years older, I would have known what it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that physical interaction didn't go further. It was the kind of that innocent hand-holding and so on.
Yeah, I had no idea. I didn't even know what gay meant.
Did anybody see you holding hands?
No.
Did anybody?
We were just in my parents' apartment watching TV, and it was dark.
Do you think if your parents had walked into the room at that point, you would have pulled your hand away?
No, I don't think they would have noticed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
They would have been oblivious. Maybe. My mother would have certainly been oblivious. Many years later, I told my father that I was gay, and his response was, "So what else is new? I already knew that." So I was the one who was shocked. I says, "Daddy, how did you know?" And he says, "Your poetry, your drawings. But don't tell your mother, she'll be upset." Which she was when I did have to tell her.
It's always interesting, right? Is that what you expected from your dad versus your mom in terms of
the upsetness?
Yeah.
Well, I certainly expected my mother to be upset. She was much more traditional. Remember, she was born in Poland. She was raised in Orthodox, and was still pretty traditional. My father was out in the world more. He didn't quite understand. He once said to me, I don't understand it. Why are you attracted to women? I says, well, so are you, Daddy.
And what was his rebuttal?
He didn't say anything.
You stopped him in his tracks, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. As you go on to high school, what changes in terms of your recognition of sexuality?
I didn't know what was going on. I was the problem with high school is that the first year I was commuting to the Bronx. I had passed the test for Science High, and I didn't understand that what it meant for me was that I wouldn't have any friends. The first year I was alone, pretty much. I was commuting an hour and a half each way because it was so prestigious to go there. And I didn't know what was wrong, and I was kind of out of it. Then the school sent me for therapy. They recognized that something was wrong. Apparently that happened to a lot of Bronx High School of Science kids, that there was so much pressure from the parents to succeed and whatever else was going on. There were kind of like with these Japanese kids who try to commit suicide. Well, there were a lot of suicide attempts. So the teachers were on guard to look for problems with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the second year we moved to the Bronx, we got into a public housing project.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just a short bus ride. And there, another act of rebellion. These are just a couple that I remember. We were in social studies class. The teacher, Mrs. Gordon, I remember her, was telling us about World War II. And then at the end of it, she talked about how when the Allies won, they took General Tojo and a bunch of other Japanese generals and tried them for war crimes and hung them and burned their bodies and sent the ashes home to the families. Well, as it happened, the girl that I had become friends with, who rode on the same bus line with me, was Kazuyo Shiraishi from Japan. And when I heard that, I wasn't even thinking, I just got upset. And I raised my hand, and the teacher called on me, and I said, well, I suppose if the Japanese had won the war, they would have done the same to Franklin Roosevelt and all our generals. The teacher turned red, and she says, I never want to hear anybody say anything like that again. It was like I had committed blasphemy in the Catholic Church or something. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was worshipped by people like her.
Right.
And I had said something that was unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it was, perfectly logical.
Mm-hmm.
And the other kids looked around. They said, what happened? They were, most of them had been falling asleep. I said, what did she say? What did she say? And I walked out of there feeling proud of myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You were able to shift the angle a little bit of perception, and she wasn't able to go with that for a moment.
Right.
Like you had sinned. Let me just make sure the sound is coming through. Say hello.
Oh, hello.
Oh, it's coming through very nicely.
Okay. Now, Kazuyo was here from Japan. I guess she was studying, her family was doing business in this country. And then later on, her father took me to see the Kabuki theater.
Mm.
So, I guess she must have told him, this is my friend who stuck up for me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
I loved that Kabuki theater.
Where was the Kabuki theater?
Somewhere in Manhattan.
Yeah.
They were visiting.
In your family, did you ever hear any prejudice against Japanese during the war or post the war?
The only prejudices that I heard were feelings about the Germans and some feelings about the Poles, but these were not based on. This wasn't just a question of prejudice. This was people telling me stories that what had happened to them or their relatives.
Right.
My mother told me about the pogroms that she had experienced and what she had seen personally. Later on, I heard various prejudices from certain relatives who had been born here and who had, used certain, the N-word and stuff like that. But not my parents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, when you said that, I think to this day, when my father speaks about World War II, he'll still say, then the Japs did, still, I don't even know if he knows that he's doing that, and I don't think if he had a Japanese neighbor he would have any problem whatsoever. It's just, the use of it is just
right.
Ancient at this point and habitual. Talk about sexual awareness as high school comes along and what that was like for you.
I was just confused. I had no idea what it was about, what the feelings were, or anything. I remember going out with boys and, kissing in the movie theater, and that was just sort of like, this messy exchange of spittle. And then I did decide to arrange, I wanted to find out what this was all about. So I arranged to go out with this one guy and have and lose my virginity in the back seat of a car in a drive-in movie. Again, no feelings whatsoever. He wanted to do more. I just didn't want to have anything to do with him afterwards. It was an experiment. It didn't make me feel anything, and I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. Then later on, when I was 18, I did have a short affair with a guy. That was good. The sex was good. What happened was, I was studying judo. I joined the first all-women's judo class in New York City. And I was having fantasies about the instructor. A woman, of course. And didn't quite understand what was going on. Meanwhile, I went to this party and met this guy and ended up having an affair with him for several weeks. My mother did not approve. She didn't know I was having sex with him. But his name was Patrick Fitzgerald. This did not fit into my mother's idea of what...
Why? He's a nice Jewish boy.
Right, yeah. So the sex was okay, but nothing great. I didn't know, how to have an orgasm then. He didn't know, certainly, how to help me have one. And then one night, my best friend from judo invited me over to her place. We also rode home on the same subway line. I went further up to the Bronx. She went to upper part of Manhattan. And she had an apartment with her husband at the time. She had gotten married early to get away from a really abusive father, drunk and abusive. And we would meet at campus because it turns out we were both going to City College. She was a few years older because she had taken some time off after marrying right out of high school and doing other things. I was now back to school. And we would hang out on campus. So she invited me over for dinner, and we sat around and we talked, and her husband came home. He was an engineer. He went straight to bed because he had to be up before dawn to be on a construction project. And we ended up making out in the living room. Then I understood what kissing really meant. I went home and I thought, that's what it is, and that's who I am. And I thought I would go to through the fires of hell for kisses like that. So I was crazy in love.
Did it scare you at all? Did it register, this means gay, lesbian?
Oh yeah, I knew what lesbian meant at that point. I didn't think I felt scared. I think I didn't know enough to be scared. I was at that stage in life where you still think you're immortal. But nothing really bad had happened to me, and I didn't expect anything would.
Did this continue with the judo teacher?
The fantasies, no. Once I had fallen in love with the other student, the judo teacher was out of my mind.
Okay. And what continued with that other student?
It was back and forth because of her upbringing, her being abused. She wasn't, as I figured out much later, really capable of an intimate relationship. And I left home, actually on the day that my mother found my birth control, which at that point I thought, forget about it. I'm out of here. There's no way. And I knew I didn't need the birth control anymore, but I wasn't about to explain that I really didn't need it because I was having an affair with my best girlfriend. So I found a cheap apartment. An apartment. It wasn't even an apartment. It was a room in one of these SRO welfare hotels.
Where was that located?
Upper West Side of Manhattan. I walked back and forth trying to find one that I could afford, and at that point I was going to school part-time and working part-time. So I couldn't afford very much. And then as soon as I switched over to going to work full-time and then going to school 4 nights a week, then I was able to afford an actual apartment.
At this point, you're at City College over at a convent, and
yes,
right, that's where David went also.
Right.
Well, one of the places he went. Beautiful campus. What was your major there?
I fooled around with different ones and ended up with a bachelor's in social sciences and literature.
So now it's the early 60s. Are you
1963 at that point?
1963. You're good with dates. Often when I do this, somebody will give me. I'm thinking, no, that can't be right. So 1963. Were you making your way into the Village at all at that time?
I had. I actually went to. There was a gay bar a lesbian bar called the Sea Colony that I went to a couple of times, and I never had a good time at those places. You had to be very much like either butch or femme, and very much into those stereotypical roles, and dress right, and I didn't know how to do that. I've never been good at that. So I never met anybody at the bars, and I never had a good time, and I hated the places. What happened for me was that I read this book, I think it was The Homosexual in America, and in the back there was a list of organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis, and there was the address of the place and the phone number, and I found out where they were and where they met, and I went there, and that was kind of where I found a home, because I could sit at a meeting and I could talk and it wasn't all noisy, and I didn't have to put on a special kind of suit, and people would listen to me talk and talk back, and I could connect with them that way.
I have a couple of questions around this. One is just like, do you have a sense of where that was in the city?
I know it was on the west side. It was kind of a warehouse building that they had an office, and I'll be damned if I remember the street.
Okay. And were those butch femme roles predominant there as well in the
More
Daughters
or
of
less.
Bilitis?
They were various, yeah, but it was not as hard-edged. Some people were more into it than others, and I think those were more like the working class kids. The ones who had more education, it was softer.
And what were the kind of things that you would talk about in these meetings? What were the subjects?
Well, let's see. There was some legal stuff. There was sometimes about some literature, I think. I'm kind of hazy about this. And then there was the why we are not crazy kind of thing, and then how to make your lesbian marriage work. That was one that came up fairly frequently. And they would sometimes have guest speakers, like this one psychologist, I guess, who would come and tell us why we weren't crazy.
Nice. This is before 1972 or 3.
That was when I joined. It was November of 1967, and I would go to these meetings. Early on, the woman who was the who was actually running the place, or she and her lover, asked me if I would run for treasurer. And I thought that was nice. That was an honor. I didn't realize I was running unopposed because nobody wanted the job. I was all of 24, maybe 23. I guess I was 23 then. So I was the treasurer for a short while. I knew nothing about bookkeeping. And I would just write down the money that had been taken in, how much I had borrowed for car fare the next day, when I had returned it. Because I was, pretty marginal even then. I did have my own place. And finally, she asked me to do something else, and I handed over the books. And there were two women, Jean Powers and Eleanor Kravitz. Eleanor was a professional bookkeeper, and she went over the stuff and she said, this was the screwiest thing in the way of books that she had ever seen, but I have to hand it to you, you didn't steal a penny. And I says, no, I'm not a bookkeeper. I didn't know what to do. I just wrote down what came in and what went out and where.
Seems obvious enough,
Yeah.
right? In and out.
But she was used to double entry bookkeeping, the usual standard.
November 1967.
That's when I joined.
Let me back up then just a little bit. But you had been to some of their meetings before?
No.
No, that is, okay.
That was the first time.
Filling in those few years there, what was your sense of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the counterculture, the hippie counterculture?
Okay. Civil rights movement, I was really too young to go down south and be part of that. That was happening when I was in high school, and my parents were not about to let me go into danger when I was... I'll back up a little more. I was born in December 1943. I started kindergarten at age 4.5. I skipped a year when I was in junior high school. So when I entered college, I was 16. Still not old enough for my parents to say, yes, go on down there and fight.
Yeah.
Okay.
16, wow.
Anti-war movement. Shortly after I left home, I went on my first march on the Pentagon.
October 67? Is
No.
that the Norman Mailer book?
I don't remember which one.
Armies of the Night?
No, there were earlier marches. I think I must have gone in the spring or summer of, I guess it would have been the spring of 64, my first march.
Early on?
Early on. Because the people that I knew and were friends with were going. And so I joined them. And our little organization, our little group was called, we had a big plaque that said CIA, Citizens in Action, to end the war in Vietnam.
That really is very early on. What do you think engendered that feeling in you so early? I mean, it's a lot of people. It took some years to get to that place.
The people I hung around with were people who I listened to what they had to say. They were older. I might agree or disagree, but those were, that was the circle I was traveling with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course it fit right in with my previous inclinations anyway.
Mm-hmm.
When I was reading about the civil rights movement, even though I was too young to join, I was horrified at what was happening. Because again, my best friend Lynn was black, and I thought, they could be doing this to her.
And were, in some
Yeah.
level, right? I mean, it is
Yeah.
the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
When you were living in the projects, what kind of mix of folk were there?
This was what was called a middle income project. Middle income means you couldn't be on welfare.
Like Left Rack City and early on before it changed over.
This was called the Marble Hill Housing Project. It was in it was in the Bronx, West Bronx, right near the river. And let's see, do you know the Bronx at all?
We're in Washington Heights, so Riverdale is right there.
Okay, so north of Riverdale. just as you cross over, if you take the IRT North, get off at 225th Street, and that would be the stop.
Oh, I know it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, big housing project there,
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
And the mix was mostly, white working class, Puerto Ricans, blacks. I would say it was probably majority white, some blacks, some Puerto Ricans.
Mm-hmm. So early on, you're brought up in a mixed environment.
And how? And remember, in my home, there were 3 different languages spoken. There was Yiddish, which my mother and father spoke to each other and to my mother's parents who didn't speak English. There was Spanish, which my mother had learned in Cuba, and which she spoke to her sisters and brother.
Oh, wow.
And and she would switch languages in the middle of a phone call, depending on who she was talking
Sure.
to.
Sure. In one of the interviews, I heard you chat a bit about LSD, and I was wondering what your take on the hippie movement, the Haight-Ashbury, and the counterculture was at the time.
I didn't really join that, but what happened was, this came later. I mean, I had been smoking marijuana with other people, as I've been introduced to that. And then during, let me think now, the winter of, let's say, 68, 69, during that school year, I was working as a secretary at Barnard College. And at that point, I was in Daughters of Bilitis, and I was the public spokesperson for DOB. So I would do things like go to abnormal psych classes and tell people why we were abnormal. And I had a technique that worked pretty well. But I'll get back.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that story, what you
Okay,
would
and
say.
then we'll get to the LSD later.
Sure.
Okay, so the technique was there'd be like 30 kids in the class. And I would pass out little slips of paper, and I would say, mark an X if you have feelings or have had sexual relations with people of your own sex, a Y if you had relations with people of the opposite sex, and both if you've had relations with both, and then fold it up so nobody else can see it and pass them back to me. So they passed them back to me, and I'd open up, and I says, well, this is a really typical class. There's 2 kids who are gay, as usual, which is about right, or 3 kids. 10% of the population is gay. And then I could see the little minds turning, which one?
I bet.
But also, the ones who were gay would be relieved because they were getting some reassurance that they were okay.
This is normal.
Right. And then I would talk about how normal really means the norm on a bell curve, and it has nothing to do with healthy or unhealthy.
Were you teaching the class, or you were invited
No,
to
I was
teach?
an invited speaker from DOB. I wasn't a teacher. I was, at that point, I was working as a secretary at Barnard College.
So that's great. So the class allowed you in for...
The teacher, had a guest speaker.
Oh, you really normalized it for them.
Yeah.
There is no normal, there is no healthy, unhealthy. These all exist.
Right. And sort of continuum. And I had already taken enough statistics and stuff like that to understand the nature of the bell curve and all that.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I had already graduated college.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right.
So when I graduated college, I was 21 because I had left home. I had gone 2.5 years to college, and when I left home, I did 2.5 more years because I was going full-time at night. I thought, I am not going to spend the next 8 years doing a bachelor's degree. I want to do this as fast as I can to get out of these miserable, low-paying jobs and into something better. That's another story. Okay, so there I was. I got on I went on TV. There was a debate between me and, what was his name, Irving Bieber, and Charles Socarides. These were you know who these guys are.
Socarides, I do. I don't know the other one.
Both of them were, homophobic shrinks. And I don't remember which one of them was proposing a center to be funded where he would cure gay people. You go kind of thinking back, I'd like to strangle the guy.
Socarides, I think, was culpable there. I don't want that for the record, but I think he's the guy.
Okay, so, and Bieber was another one. So, we debated. And at that point was when I had to tell my mother, because I thought, I do not want Aunt Estelle watching this program on daytime TV and then calling up my mother and saying, do you know what your daughter has been up to? So I told her, and she freaked out, and she said she'd pay for therapy to cure me, and so on and so forth. Okay, now there I was. At that point, big spokesperson for DOB, and I'm working at Barnard. Across the way, there was the Student Homophile League at Columbia University, and Stephen Donaldson was there.
You knew him?
Not only knew him, we used to hang out a lot together. We even had an affair, just to the hell of it.
I read that.
Yes, it is correct.
How did that happen? Here you are, the two of you are pushing for the homosexual cause, and the next thing you know, it's in the sack.
We're young. We were young. We were busy being outrageous, doing, you know the phrase "épater la bourgeoisie"?
No.
Stick it to the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
And the bourgeoisie being the older gay people who were more rigid.
Okay. Which is how the millennials feel now about
us,
older.
Yes.
Yes, they do, really.
Uh-huh.
Tell me about Stephen Donaldson. I mean, he's, famous and infamous, both at the same time.
Well, okay, at that point he was young too. He was a student. We went on a peace march together that was at Columbia, it was demonstrations against the war. I can tell you personally that my feeling about him was that he, there was something missing in his ability to have intimacy and lovingness between, to form a really one-to-one relationship with a person. I felt that. Now, maybe it happened for him later on, I don't know. But at that point, I felt it. But he was into drugs, and he was into LSD mostly, and into screwing around. And I was perfectly willing to be experimental. So one night, I stayed over there, in the men's dorm, and the deal was, in the morning we would drop acid together. Or at least I would. He was going to introduce me to acid. And he did. And it was quite an experience. And then later on in the day, when I was coming down somewhat, and the hallucinations were a little less intense, he took me to, what was that movie? The one with Thus Spake Zarathustra's music. It'll come back to me in a minute. And this guy pounding on a... I don't remember, because of course I was hallucinating at the time.
Pound? I'm thinking of Ben-Hur, for heaven's
sake. No. This was caveman pounding on a brick, and then it moves into Hal the computer, and very much science fiction, fantasy kind of a movie.
We'll loop back to it, but
yeah, if I can think of it. But in any case, that was so. That was that day, and that was my first experience with LSD.
Did you how did you feel about that experience?
I really, really enjoyed it. And I tried LSD again and other psychedelic drugs, psilocybin particularly.
Sure.
Organic mescaline. And then after a while, I stopped doing it because I thought, I've been this route before. I know what this thing has to say. I no longer need this thing. What it did for me, I think, in the long run, was open me up to seeing that there's other stuff out there besides a very scientific, rigid view of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I had been that Bronx High School of Science stuff.
Mm-hmm.
1 + 1 is 2. Well, there's other stuff out there. Aside from hallucinations, I have had one psychic experience in my life,
Mm-hmm.
which also made me think there's more out there than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio.
Mm-hmm. Do you care to mention the
Sure.
psychic experience?
Yeah. This was years later. I was 49. I was doing judo again. And I had this premonition. I did not want to go to class that day. It was the end of August, the first day of September. Hot. And I had this and it was hot and sticky, and I felt like I don't want to go today. And I thought, push yourself, go. And then I had this premonition that this one young man in the class was going to break my left ankle. I thought, well, I won't do judo today. I'll do kung fu practice, which our school did both. I get there, and the person who was leading the class, who was a black belt but not the main teacher, said, "Oh, go work with that guy," the young guy that I had the premonition about. Within seconds, I should have said no. Within seconds, I was on the floor with a broken left ankle. I couldn't even be mad at the guy because I had been warned and I had not paid attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never had an experience like that before or since, but it just tells me there's more out there than we like to think there is.
Wow, that's powerful. That's a big one. How old were you when you had that?
49.
Oh, so that like 1992 or so.
Something like that.
Oh, let me
Check
put it
that
on
out.
hold.
Let's find out what that's about.
All right, and we're back on.
Okay, where are we there?
Oh, you were talking about that experience when
With
you were 49.
LSD.
So
Back to Ellis.
How,
Okay. So that was Stephen Donaldson, a.k.a. Bob Martin. And we stayed friends. And that was, early 1969.
did you help him organize it all while he was part of the student homophile
No,
league?
he and the other people who were at Columbia were doing the organizing.
Mm-hmm.
During that same period, while I was working at Barnard, I also attended some meetings at Barnard that were made basically for students. And, what you're going to do after your degree. Of course, these were kids who had more privilege than I did at Barnard.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were, and there was stuff about feminism. And then I ran into this one instructor who I'd met at these meetings, and she had just been fired from Barnard. And she was, I guess, popular with the students. And I said, well, do you want me to help organize a demonstration for you? And she says, no, I think I'll just stay home and finish this book I'm working on. And the woman's name was Kate Millett, and the book was Sexual Politics. That's how I got to meet her.
Wow.
So I was in the heart of all this kind of ferment that was happening.
What was your impression of her?
She seemed smart and friendly and stuff, but I didn't really get to be friends with her.
Okay.
We were more like comrades in the movement, but not personally that close.
Okay. All right. The summer. So, actually, 1968, the Columbia Riots. Were you part of those at all?
No.
Okay. Was Stephen Donaldson involved in?
I think that happened before I was at
Before you
Barnard.
knew him.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the year before.
Gotcha. Now it's 1969. I know the bar scene is not your thing, the femme butch roles and all of that. I wanted to just reflect back for a second. When you were with the Daughters of Bilitis, Were you the youngest person there, or were there other people young as well? Because there is a generational difference we think of.
I think I was one of the youngest. I'm not sure if I was the youngest.
Okay. Okay.
And the reason I was able to be a public spokesperson is that I figured that I didn't have anything to lose. I mean, my secretarial job, BFD.
Yeah.
And other people had already developed some kind of long-term job stuff, or had been hounded out of jobs for being gay. Another thing I should tell you about that. That one time I got interviewed by WOR Radio. They were doing a program on the sexual revolution, and they were interviewing the girls at the dormitory. There was a new co-ed dormitory at Columbia, and they wanted to interview someone from DOB, and that would be me. So they came over to DOB one evening and interviewed me, and I thought the guy who did it was kind of a jerk. But then when it was over, I went home, and the next day I went to work, and then my boss came waltzing in. Her name was Jean Palmer, and she was the general secretary of Barnard College, which meant, I think, more like fundraising than anything else. And then you're making noise.
I'm
Wow. And she came waltzing in the next morning and said, "Guess what? WOR Radio was here last night, and they're putting this program on tonight about the sexual revolution, and they interviewed some of our students, and I guess I'm going to stay up and listen." And I thought, oh no, she's going to hear me. So I didn't know what to do. I called the people who were really doing the organizational running at the OB, Jean Powers was her name, and told her what was going on. And Jean said, "Oh, just call up WRR and tell them to take off that segment. They'll understand." And I thought, I can't do that. And I look up at the poster I have over my desk that I had put up, the picture of Martin Luther King. And I says, I cannot back down. So at the end of the day, I went to see Miss Palmer before she left, and I said, "I have something to tell you. I'm going to be on that radio show tonight." And she says, "Oh, what about?" And I said, "I'm representing the Daughters of Bilitis." And she says, "What's that?" I says, "A civil rights organization for lesbians." And she gives me a big wink. And she says, "Oh, it's so nice that all of you young people are involved in all these causes. Now help me with my jacket, dear. I'll be late."
You normalized it for students, and she normalized it for you.
Well, I found out that her partner was the woman who was head of Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School. The head of Barnard College at that time was Martha Peterson, who was a lesbian, and there was a long history of lesbians in women's education. And my boss had been the head of the Women's Navy during World War II.
Really?
So her job was, as she saw it, was to help get more women be economically independent and have jobs. That's why she was in women's education. So she made, in other words, I had done something, I had put myself out there, and nothing bad happened to me.
Yeah.
And that meant I was encouraged to go on and do more things.
Which brings us into 1969.
Right.
What's your memory of Stonewall?
Oh, it's very clear. The first night of Stonewall, Saturday night, I was taking these two women for a tour of Greenwich Village and the bars and whatnot. They wanted to start a DOB chapter in Boston. And we walked by the Stonewall, and there were these young people throwing things at cops. And they were, these women were taken aback, and I thought it was an anti-war thing. So I says, "Oh, don't worry, it's just a riot. We have them all the time." I did not know it was a gay riot. So we went home, and the next day, or the day after really, Monday morning, I read about it in the newspaper, and I thought, wow. I called Jean Powers, and I said, "We have to have a protest march." She says, "Well, why don't you call the head of Mattachine Society, who was Dick Leitch, and if they agree, we'll co-sponsor it." So I called him. He said, well, why don't you come? We're having a meeting to discuss it at Town Hall. Come and present your proposal and see what the membership thinks. I go to Town Hall on that night. I think it was a Thursday night. I'm not sure. But it was right after the Stonewall riot. And I proposed a protest march. Dick didn't seem terribly enthusiastic, but he put it to the membership, and he says, how many people are in favor? And I'm looking around, and there's 400 gay guys and me, and this woman, Madeline Cervantes, who was sort of the token heterosexual woman, member of Mattachine Society. And every hand went up. And he says, okay, those of you who want to organize the march, meet over in that corner after the meeting. And a bunch of us did. We organized that march. And it happened just about a month, on a Saturday or Sunday after, I think it was July 27th, happened right after Stonewall. And there was several hundred people. I'm not good at counting, but we marched around the village. We ended up in the little park that's right across from the Stonewall. And Marty Robinson, we had agreed Marty and I were going to speak. He was going to speak for the boys. I'm going to speak for the girls. He jumped up on the water fountain and made a speech. And then I jumped up on the water fountain and made a speech. And then I looked around and I thought, what are we going to do with this crowd? And I thought, well, we're not going to start another riot. So I said, okay, we're done for today. We're going to go home peacefully, but this is not the end. This is just the beginning.
So let me back up a little bit. And I do want to ask you what you said at that demonstration. What gave you the impetus to run with the Stonewall moment? You read about it, it's a riot, it happened. What was going on in your mind?
I have no idea, except that on the day that I thought about this, I hadn't had enough sleep for a couple of days and I was feeling somewhat feverish. And lying on my couch and thinking, and it was happening, and I think it was civil rights. It was the impulse coming from that civil rights movement. It was all of that. It was the civil rights in the Vietnam era. It was in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And it was our turn.
And when you marched around the village and you stopped there at the water fountain, what did you say?
I don't remember. I have no idea. I don't remember what Marty said. I don't remember what I said. All I remember is how I ended it. And I should say that before we got there, I was scared. I thought I was going to get shot like Martin Luther King. But I knew I had to go ahead anyway.
What was the last thing you said at that?
That we were, that we had to go home now. We were going to go. This was a peaceful demonstration, and we're going to keep it peaceful. But it's just the beginning. It's not the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was the feeling in the air in the village at that time, is there a before and after Stonewall sensibility that you recognized after that had happened? Were things revving up?
I couldn't say. Because remember, I didn't hang around the village that much. I think looking back on it, that it was pretty obvious things had changed.
Mm-hmm.
People were really proud of themselves for having fought back against the cops. And people who hadn't been there were encouraged to come out. A lot of the people who came to that demonstration that some of us organized had never been out in public in the sunshine, letting the world know that they were gay. Mm-hmm. This was their first time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think Allen Ginsberg said something like, the guys don't have that depressed look anymore, or something like that. Something.
Yeah.
I just forgot my question. it'll come back to me. So, if you could talk about how this, where this goes, what comes next, and the Gay Liberation Front.
Easy. While we were organizing, we met at the while we were organizing that demonstration, we were meeting at the Mattachine Society headquarters. They had an office, and we'd sit around and talk. And I remember I got the assignment to call the police and find out if we needed a permit for a march. The last people I wanted to talk to were the police, but I got on the phone and I called them. And of course I didn't tell them what the march was about, but I said, do we need a permit to have a march? And they said, only if you have sound equipment. You need a permit for sound equipment. And I thought, who needs that? I didn't expect a big march. I knew I could yell loud enough to be heard down the street because I had been involved in a union strike where I was leading chants on a picket line. So I knew I could make noise. And so we're having these meetings. And then there was one meeting, it was a summer afternoon, it's hot in New York, we're drinking beer. And we're talking. And I don't know how it came up, but somebody, and people say it was me, said Gay Liberation Front. And I started pounding on the table and saying, yes, yes, that's it, we're the Gay Liberation Front. And then I looked at my hand, and there had been a pop top there, and I'd been slamming my hand into the sharp edge of the pop top, and I was bleeding.
Stigmatism.
I was pretty, a little bit tipsy.
Stigmata, rather, not stigmatism.
And then what happened was Dick Leitch ran in. He had overheard that, and he said he was just furious because he thought we were organizing another group under his very nose in his offices that was going to draw membership away from Mattachine Society. And I said, oh no, we're not. I lied through my teeth. I said, we're not organizing another group. We just gave ourselves the name for our little committee here.
Well, and this is
I knew we were organizing another group.
Sure. So there's a couple of interesting things that I'm thinking of right now. One is that my sense was that Mattachine Society, when Stonewall happened, wasn't exactly thrilled that Stonewall happened, that they thought that was unruly and it was going to ruin things. What was your sense of the reaction of Mattachine? And what was the reaction of Daughters of Bilitis?
Mattachine, I didn't know Mattachine that well. All I knew was Dick Leitch, and I thought he was definitely not happy about the whole business. I don't know if he was unhappy about the Stonewall riot per se, but I think he was unhappy about what the rowdiness, because both he and the people who were running Daughters of Bilitis, their whole thrust was to be assimilated into American society.
Accepted.
We're just a little bit different. We want to be accepted. We want the house with the white picket fence, which I now have.
He was right.
Well, it wasn't what I was looking for.
Then.
The white picket fences we put up there because the dogs were pooping in our front yard. But that was, they just wanted to be let alone to do their jobs and to be accepted and to not be beaten up or fired and so on.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't. A lot of us younger people, we wanted to overthrow the system. We were socialists. We were, I'm talking about in general, we were anti-racist, anti-war. A lot of us were sort of hippie-ish. And, I used to walk around in bell-bottoms and stuff like that. I was never a full-fledged hippie, but a lot of that had rubbed off.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't interested in, the 9 to 5 and the corporate job. I hated the whole business. Mm-hmm. I wanted to change the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you, as time went on, did you feel that was a definite split between you, the new organizations, and the old organizations?
Yeah. The people who were part of the old organizations tended to stay there. the ones who were part of the old organizations who were more radical and had been restive came over to Gay Liberation Front.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Gay Liberation Front then attracted a whole lot of people who weren't affiliated with the old organizations, some of whom were political radicals who'd been involved in various kinds of socialist and Marxist groups, but who were gay and felt oppressed as gays within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice any of that oppression within the anti-war movement and the women's movement of the time against gay people?
Not specially, but then I wasn't, I would go to demonstrations and things like that, but I wasn't I wasn't part of any kind of organized Marxist kind of group.
Gotcha. I mean, I know...
I was too much of a hippie dip for that. More of an anarchist, I would say, as opposed to a hippie.
Do you feel that the hippie movement positively, or how did the hippie movement influence the gay movement? Was it a positive influence?
In part. The part that was positive was the kind of loosening up our society. The music, the radicalism, but it wasn't political. But some of the culture, the counterculture stuff, definitely was part of what we became. It had its influence. The part that some of us didn't care for was the kind of apolitical counterculture capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have much respect for that.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah. People whose idea of the counterculture was to figure out how to make as much money off the thing as possible with music posters, various kinds of psychological things. Try to think of a better word for that. A lot of the music industry at the time. You'd see people walking around in these flashy outfits, and their idea of the counterculture was, okay, we're going to have all these people make music, and we're going to record it, and we're going to put it out there and have all these shows, and the idea is to make as much money as possible with absolutely no thought for the political stuff, the oppression of people around the world. They didn't care whether there was a war going on or not.
Mm-hmm. Did you go to the Fillmore or Fillmore East to see shows at all?
I did. A couple of times. There was one time that I went to see Miriam Makeba, but that was earlier on. And then there was another time, Ike and Tina Turner when they were still together.
Great show. Okay, Gay Liberation Front. Now, you came up with the name. Were you?
So they say.
So they say.
I cannot completely take credit for it because I was somewhat potted at the time.
Okay.
I mean, tipsy.
Okay, all right.
So,
by the way, Dick Leach died recently,
yes,
right?
I do.
He had his funeral in the city. Were you thinking National Liberation Front when you came up with Gay Liberation Front?
Oh yeah, National Liberation Front of North Vietnam. Mm-hmm.
Were you comfortable with the, obviously you were, with the cross-reference of movements?
Oh yeah. Do you remember a poster, a picture, it's all full color, Ho Chi Minh sitting under a tree, and it says Vietnam will win in various languages?
No.
Okay.
I'll look it up though.
Okay. Beautiful poster. I had it in my funky little apartment at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we were supporting the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these revolutions turn into whatever they're going to turn into, but what I was very aware of and very much against was the United States had no right to be there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With the Gay Liberation Front, can you talk about how you started organizing after that?
Okay,
What went into the group, how you kept in communication with one another, how you got zaps going or whatever it is.
Okay, I'm going to have, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to have to end this and go back to work.
Okay.
So I'll do my best. If you want, how long are you going to be in the Portland area?
We're going, right after this, we're going to Astoria, and then we're coming back on Sunday to get the 9 o'clock flight home.
9 p.m. or 9 a.m.?
9 p.m.
9 p.m.
We could...
You could stop by on Sunday and we can continue.
Okay. Is that all right, David?
What?
We'll come back on Sunday. We'll come back just a little bit early, just to finish. He wants to use the bathroom.
Well, you have to go out to the outhouse.
Outhouse?
No, right over that way. So go ahead with the Gay Liberation.
Okay, what happened was the people who were involved, who were radical politically, in Marxist type or other socialist groups, who were in meeting at a place called Alternate U, had a meeting, and some of us came over. They were, I guess, I don't remember who decided to invite us or whatever, but we all met together, and it was there that I definitely proposed Gay Liberation Front. Carla J. remembers that. I don't actually remember that, but she's a witness to it. And so those of us who were in both groups started meeting at Alternate U. And what we did was we agreed to keep it a kind of anarchistic thing. Whoever wanted to work on a particular project, get together with other people who want to work on that kind of project, and go do it. You didn't need the whole group to tell you what to do or to vote on it. So some of us wanted to work on a newspaper, and we did, and that was Come Out. Other people wanted to put on dances, and they did that. And people came up with the idea of demonstrations, and whoever wanted to organize it, we would all show up and do it. The one thing I remember about Alternate U was the bathroom. Okay, this was this big old industrial kind of building, and somebody had written on the bathroom wall, and God said E equals MC squared, and there was a light show, groovy.
Oh, neat.
And then right above the toilet paper roll was Harvard diplomas, take one. So I felt right at home at this place.
Sure.
We did organize dances there. I remember Bob Kohler as laboring heroically. He was there from the beginning. He was sitting right next to me at that Town Hall Mattachine Society meeting, talking about the young guys who were whoring in the streets because they had been thrown out from their families and had no other way of making a living, and what was happening to them. And he was a stalwart in our group. Older guy. He was like about 40 when I was 25. And the newspaper Come Out, a bunch of us got together and did that. And aside from writing articles for it, I typeset it at night, because the woman that I worked for, I was doing a 3-day-a-week typesetting job. And the typesetting was on these cold type machines, which had just been invented, really. It was before everybody had computers. And so at night I would stay and use the machines. The boss used to typeset the mailing list for the Black Panthers. She was a radical, an old-time radical. She was in her early 60s then. And her son, she had raised him, I guess, after her ex-husband or whatever had, and she had divorced and he hadn't been around very much. He wanted to be an actor, and she had been supporting him in his dreams. And he actually became successful. His name was Robert De Niro.
Oh my God. People tell me I look like him. Really?
Yeah. So years later, when I went to visit her, and she had retired, I said, "Well, it looks like you can afford to retire now." And she says, "Yes."
Oh, he's carrying on, right? After
Yeah.
the Tonys recently. Trump.
Yeah.
Some people didn't like that. Some people liked it.
Oh, yeah.
It sounded like
I wouldn't fuck him. I wouldn't touch him with a
No.
10-foot pole. I understand he paid $30,000 to Stormy Daniels. You couldn't pay me $30 million to touch that man.
Ugh. What a nightmare we're in.
Yeah. Anyway, so I was working there, and I typeset the paper at night and wrote for it. And at one point, again, when I was no longer working for Virginia Admiral, that was Robert's mother's name, I visited her, and we talked, and she said that one thing about me was that was I never seemed to resent being her wage slave. And I said, well, that was because I was working 3 days a week, and I had all this other time to do what I wanted. You were the one who was working like a dog. And she said, yeah, I'm so glad it's over. That she worked 7 days a week to keep that business going.
Wow. But you had a big job at what you got out flyers and everything else, right?
Well, mostly the paper is what I
the
typed.
paper primarily.
The paper primarily. And I sold it on the street.
Where'd you sell it?
In the village, mostly. I stood on the street corner with the paper, and I remember being somewhat obnoxious at the time with my youth. This young people, people would come by, and some would buy it and some wouldn't. And this one couple came by, young couple with a stroller and the kid in it, and they just acted like I wasn't even there walking by. So I yelled, "Get your copy of Come Out Here, Gay Liberation Front newspaper, find out what your kid's going to be like when he grows up." And they jumped.
Did they look back at you?
No, they practically ran away.
Oh, man. Tough. I don't know, maybe if you're wanting to stop, we should stop. Because I was going to ask about the relationship of the Gay Liberation Front to the Black Panthers and to the Gay Activist Alliance and so on.
That's another whole long story.
Do you want me to?
Well, let's do it on Sunday.
All right.
I'm
That's
having
all
fun,
for now.
But I've got miles to go before I...
So this is Stephen Palmer with Martha Shelley, part 2 of our interview. This is August 19th, and we're in Portland, Oregon. So we're continuing the discussion we had from last Wednesday, and Martha has a couple of things she'd like to open up with, so we're going to go right to that.
Okay. I talked about how we first had the first protest march after Stonewall. And then, of course, a year later, we had a big march that people did from, I guess, downtown all the way to Central Park. Mm-hmm. And it was all these gay people, and there were no corporate floats or any kind of floats, really. It was just hundreds, maybe thousands of gay people with banners and picket signs and stuff like that. Well, over the years, it's become more and more corporate floats and this organization and that organization. And what's happened in New York City that I've heard is that this group called Heritage of Pride has been running the show. And what they have done recently that people are really upset about is, well, there were several things, but the thing that upset me the most was more and more corporate floats, and they had this policy where no organization could have more than 200 participants. But they allowed the corporations to have as many as they wanted. And then we find out just recently that the reasons for that is that the corporations are paying money, they're sponsoring the thing. And so they not only are sponsoring, they pay for placement in the parade. So they get up front, and the first 3 hours of the parade are covered by national television. So it's like the parade becomes a big advertisement for these corporations, many of which do things that are completely antithetical to what we in Gay Liberation Front were for. And I'm not talking about, world revolution or anything. I'm talking about simple things like social justice, anti-racism, and so on. For me, one of the big issues is with corporations like Wells Fargo, and I'm just bringing up one of them. I'm sure the other ones are equally criminal. But over the years, what Wells did was, before 2008, targeted Black and Hispanic communities for subprime mortgages. And people put their life savings into these mortgages, and of course when the bubble bust, they lost all their life savings. So this huge amount of wealth that had been accumulated in these communities was drained off by Wells Fargo when they were foreclosed upon. Another thing they've done is invested heavily in for-profit prisons, and we know who goes to those prisons, and that those people are used as slave labor, essentially. Another recent thing that Wells Fargo did was open up all these fake accounts in the names of depositors, and then the depositors didn't know that those accounts were opened, and then their real accounts had money deducted from them to pay for the fees on the phony accounts. And if you happened to be an employee of Wells Fargo and didn't go along with this and objected to this, you got fired. But we're supposed to let Wells Fargo have a big prominent place in the parade because they pay money. And the other excuse is that it gives a chance for gay people who are employees to feel secure in their jobs with these corporations. Well, I'm sure, gay people could have felt secure in their jobs working at concentration camps if that had been allowed, as long as they were willing to follow orders. I can't tell you how furious this makes me, and how furious it makes me that the people who are running the parade are so unscrupulous or oblivious to what they're doing. They're getting salaries for doing this thing, paid for by the corporations. And they're betraying everything that we ever stood for. Mm-hmm. So that's my rant for the day.
No, I love that. I was just Wells Fargo, though. Is that on the East Coast as well, or?
Yeah, they're all over. But they started in the West, but I think they're all over.
It's, just conversationally, it's disappointing. I don't go to the parade, but it's disappointing when I go there and there's the AT&T float, and then there's Spectrum float, and all of it. Look, there has to be money around, obviously, but it's kind of like the gay revolution brought to you by Tanqueray, and it's just...
Or Martin Luther King Day brought to you by Pepsi Cola.
Right. Well, Woodstock 2 in 1994 was brought to you by Pepsi. Remember that?
I didn't go to that. No.
So it feels like it just doesn't mean anything.
No.
Right. So to the Gay Liberation Front, this would have been an anathema.
Yeah, we put on that first march, the one that happened in 1970 with thousands of people, and it didn't cost us anything. It cost the individuals money to make their banners and make their signs that they carried. It doesn't have to cost a bunch of money.
Yeah. Could you talk about the first parade, your experience, how it started out, where you were, the whole thing?
Well, didn't I talk to you about the protest march that we did?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
A year later, we had this big march. I don't know who organized it. I was part of it. So I was just a participant, and I can't tell you who organized it, except that I was there, and there were no floats, and there was nobody except human beings out in the street. And it was later that the corporations muscled in, and the excuse was that gay people within those organizations, how nice it is that the corporations are letting them work and not firing them.
Right.
And that they get to be, they get benefits like whatever benefits that they get for spousal stuff and so on, health care if they get it at all. and that therefore we should be okay with all of this. I'm not okay with it. It's not that I object to, well, yeah, I do object to capitalism. Let's get honest. It's not that I object to large organizations that work and produce things. What I object to is the criminality of a lot of these corporations and the global criminality.
Right, right. I guess this is one of those places where the word intersectionality actually works very well.
That's another issue. In the case of Wells, and I'm sure lots of other corporations, the way they treat other communities, people of color, the way they import stuff made by slave labor in the third world. All of those crimes in the name of enriching the very, very top 0.001%. There are 8 people in the world, at current count, who own more than about half the wealth of the world. 6 of them are Americans. The rest of us, we struggle from paycheck to paycheck, or if we have, Sylvia and I own our house. That's not going to do us any good if we become really, really disabled and one of us has to go into, say, assisted living.
Mm-hmm.
Those things cost so much money, we'd have to sell the house and go completely bankrupt. And then when we didn't have any money, where would they put us? Don't know.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't be able to stay in those, quote, assisted living places.
Right. Right. Welcome to America.
Yeah. If you accumulate anything, they try as hard as they can to take it away from you before you die, so that any children that you have, any heirs, don't have anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there anything else that you wanted to?
Not on that particular issue. So
Excellent.
why don't you go on with your next?
Okay. So, and we had left off at that the march you had in July after Stonewall, July
Right.
27th or so. And you jumped up, and somebody else jumped up to
Marty
give
Robinson, who later became part of GAA.
Who became part of GAA. If first you could just bring us through your experience of the first march, how it's, where you marched up, what the reaction of the people on the sidelines were, what it was like when you got to Central Park.
You mean the one in 1970?
The first Christopher Street Liberation Day.
Okay. I don't remember a whole lot of it. What I do remember is the marching itself. And there were people on the sidelines who were, spectators, people, taking photographs or whatever. And then we got to the park and we're hanging around in Central Park in the big meadow. And people, like tourists, were taking pictures of us like we were animals at the zoo or something. I really did not like them. Now I'm more mellow, but in those days I was pretty damn angry.
Did you say anything to them?
I did to one, and didn't get anywhere.
What did you say?
Just told him to stop taking pictures of us and sort of reached for his camera. He grabbed it away. He was a tourist from Germany who was there with his wife.
Some people have recounted that when they started out there was like 30 people, and then they went along and they're scared, and they were hoping more people would come, and then as they go up it starts to grow and grow, and then they look back
and there were thousands.
How did you feel when you look back and it had grown like that?
Elated, totally elated. But I wasn't one of the people who didn't expect it at that point. At that point, the first one, that demonstration that we did in Greenwich Village, I wasn't sure who would come out or anything. And I was, as I said before, I was scared that somebody might shoot me. But after that, we did so many demonstrations. At one point or another, we were part of a peace march, an anti-war march in the city that I think passed by the public library, and you know, there were some people who made disparaging remarks. Mostly Pete Hamill of the who was writing for the New York Post, and at that point it was a liberal newspaper, and he referred to us as the slim-waisted creeps of the Gay Liberation Front. This guy was supposedly a liberal.
The slim-waisted creeps
of the Gay Liberation Front. He was, busy being a macho guy. So there were jerks like that. There always were. I suppose there always will be. There certainly still are jerks like that. And at that point, I'd been through enough demonstrations that I wasn't surprised when there were thousands of us. I don't know why I wasn't, but I wasn't. I just felt much more confident about more and more of us being out in public.
When you were marching up 6th Avenue that day, the first year, did anybody come off the sidewalks and join in? Do you remember anything like that? People
don't remember.
And the scene that ended up happening in Sheep's Meadow.
Uh-huh.
I know at first it was everybody was going to get up there and there was no plan afterwards. What was that scene like in the Sheep's Meadow?
We sat around, hung around, talked to each other, and then eventually dispersed and went home. It was almost like a picnic, except I don't think we brought any food.
Others had sort of described it as like a be-in almost, because it was
exactly.
over time, headbands and long hair and necking
Yeah, exactly. It was just a very pleasant afternoon.
Did you march with the Gay Liberation Front in that parade?
I don't remember. I think I marched, with whoever I was next to. I think there were Gay Liberation Front people with me, but there were also people from other groups too.
Okay.
Who just milled around. It wasn't as that well organized that each was a separate group.
Okay. Actually, I just said, did you march with other Gay Liberation Front in that parade? And I've been told many times over that it wasn't a parade.
Right, it was a march.
Could you talk about the Gay Activists Alliance and the differences between the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance and how you felt about them?
Sure. Some people formed the Gay Activists Alliance because they were really into that single issue electoral politics of improving things for gays and working with the system and with politicians. I was kind of sad about losing some of our Gay Liberation Front people, but I always felt that it was a mistake for the GLF to split up into so many different groups. When Radical Lesbians split off, I went along with it. I joined Radical Lesbians, but I didn't really approve of that. Same thing with the Third World Gay Revolutionaries, the people who were, black and so on, or the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries and so on. I just thought it was a mistake to split off. It made more sense to me to have people do what we had originally started, which was if you have an action that you want to do or an issue you want to work on it, but don't divide the group so much. Stay within the group and have a kind of united front there, and then work on whatever feels like it's an important thing for you. However, my voice didn't matter in that thing. When people felt that they wanted to split off because people weren't listening to their issues or doing what they thought was right, they just went and split off. As far as Gay Activists Alliance versus GLF, at that time I felt that there was room in the world for both, and I still feel that way. That one of the things about GLF was that Gay Activists Alliance could go to the city council or some other organization or a newspaper or university or whatever and say, listen to us, make these changes that will benefit our people, or else you have to face the crazy radicals out there. Well, I was one of the crazy radicals, and I liked being that. But I realized that we weren't going to take over the system the way it was, and that one of our functions was to be the threat, the radical left-wing threat that made the institutions as they existed more willing to make concessions.
Interesting. You were talking about all of the other groups that, when you talk about like Radical Lesbians and the Third World Group, were those considered cells of the Gay Liberation Front?
No, they became separate organizations.
Separate organizations. And did the folks who went to those groups come back to larger GLF meetings, or were they gone?
A few of them came back as individuals. You showed up at meetings, but mostly they did, they were gone.
And how many people were there in the GLF at its height?
That I don't remember because we didn't keep a membership list. We'd have a meeting and maybe 30 people would show up. If there was an action, depending on the action, different numbers of people would show up, but there wasn't anyone who kept tabs on how many members there was, because we didn't have that sort of thing. We were very anarchistic. If you showed up at a meeting, you were part of it. That was it.
Could you talk about your involvement with Radical Lesbians?
Yeah, what happened was some of the women got PO'd because they felt that at the gay dances that we were putting on, there wasn't anybody to check to make sure that whoever showed up there was gay. It was not like you had to pull out a gay ID card. So straight guys would come in and they would harass or feel up the women there, and these were like really crowded venues. Not venues, they were just, we'd have a big hall or warehouse, and we'd have this party, and some of the women got harassed by straight guys who showed up. And the women got really pissed, and the gay guys were busy, paying attention to each other and trying to make out or whatever, and paying no attention to what was going on with the women. So we decided to have a separate dance, just a women's dance. And those women's dances, I remember, sometimes 50 to 100 women would show up. And out of that came Radical Lesbians.
What were some of the issues that Radical Lesbians worked on?
The one big issue, the one thing that we were really successful at, was at the Second Congress to Unite Women. Most of the time, we didn't do diddly squat. We sat around and argued with each other, and there was this one woman whose name I will not mention, who we agreed that we would do things by consensus. That meant everybody had to agree. And she would show up at meetings and vote no on everything that we tried to do, so that we were absolutely stymied. We couldn't get things done. I thought it was nuts, but that was what happened. And the Second Congress to Unite Women, I do not know who started that, whose idea it was to do that. There were a number of women involved. Have you heard a description of what happened?
Yes, as you're talking, one part of me thinks I already interviewed you on this. I didn't. It's because I'm reading Carla J's book at the same time.
Okay.
And so that person who was kind of screwing up every vote, was there a consideration that may have been an informant or something?
No, I know who she is. She's just a nut. She's still part of an email list for Gay Liberation Front, but she's kind of wacko.
Oh dear.
And there's always wackos around.
No.
I did encounter somebody who was an agent provocateur back in those days, which is a separate story. But let me get to the...
Go ahead.
Okay, so what happened was, whoever organized this thing, they made Lavender Menace t-shirts, stenciled them. I got one of them. I was brought in to the action. We showed up with other shirts on top of our Lavender Menace shirts, sat around in the auditorium, and then at one point, somebody, I think it was Donna Gottschalk, turned off the lights in back. It may have been her, it may have been somebody else. And the auditorium was in darkness. When whoever it was flipped on the lights again, there were posters all over, or placards all over the walls. Take a lesbian to lunch. Somebody lesbian loves you, etc. And then all of us had our Lavender Menace shirts on. And what I did was I jumped up onto the stage where there was this panel discussion, and the panel discussion was supposed to be one black woman and one woman from the unions and one woman from this and one woman from that, and none of them lesbian. So I got up there and I said that this is what we got here, and Now, which had organized the thing, was supposedly trying to unite women, but not including lesbians.
Let me just mention, Now is National Organization for Women.
Right. And I then said to the audience, do you want to continue with the panel discussion as it is, or do you want to hear what we have to say? Let's take a vote. And people wanted to hear what we had to say. So the whole thing turned into a discussion about what we had to say. And that was what turned Now around and made freedom from oppression for lesbians, or however they put it, part of their platform, much to Betty Friedan's unhappiness.
She wasn't there?
No, she was not there, but she had started, essentially she and some other women had started Now, and she was the Almanas Gris of Now, because of that book she wrote, The Feminine Mystique. Was very involved in it. But for her, the whole thing was within the context of essentially white women, suburban women, women with husbands and children, and middle-class jobs. It was a very oriented towards middle-class white women at that point. And then they brought in black women because they realized they had to do that, and it made sense, of course. But the idea that women who were not heterosexual, it was too scary for them. It was certainly scary for Betty Friedan.
Why do you think that was the case?
Honest answer? I think she had some real problems with it herself. One of the women who I knew from that era, who is since deceased, and as Friedan I believe is deceased, said that one night they were in a hotel talking about issues, and Friedan got drunk and made a pass at her. And this was Myrna Lamb, the playwright, and she got out of there real fast.
Apparently, Carla J. said that she saw Friedan like 20 years later, and Betty Friedan looked at her and pointed her finger and said, "You made a lot of trouble for me." And Carla J. said, "Get over it already." Right? I mean, this is like 1997 or something. Actually, in the book, the Lavender Menace, the memoir, there's discussion about red stockings as well. Were you at all part of red stockings?
No, I was not.
Okay. As time goes on with Gay Liberation Front, what other sort of activities did you end up participating in, and what led to the end of the GLF?
I think it just disintegrated, a combination of, splitting off the way it did, people going in different directions. I went in different directions. I got involved with Rat newspaper and the women's takeover of that newspaper. I started doing radio programming for WBAI. I was invited by Nanette Raynon, who I think was a program manager at that point. And I did a program every week called Lesbian Nation. This one young man taught me how to do the tape editing. It was, you actually cut the tapes with a razor blade in those days, cut and splice. So I ran around with a little tape recorder and did interviews and put them on the air and mixed it in with music and stuff like that. So I was very involved with more media stuff at that point, and not that involved with Gay Liberation Front qua organization.
Mm-hmm.
I would go to demonstrations, of course, but I wasn't doing the organizational stuff.
And what year did GLF kind of come to its demise?
That I don't know. You'd have to talk to people who were there at the demise.
All right. I mean, I'm wondering to what extent that had to do with the 70s are moving on and the revolutionary bite is beginning to fade.
No, I think it was in 1972, really, that's my thought about it, that it lasted that long. But then, again, people went on to this collective or that collective.
What do you think the legacy of GLF has been?
That is a darn good question. One of them is that without GLF, without that response to Stonewall, we wouldn't have the kind of gay movement that actually we have today, or even that we had earlier. We wouldn't have gay marriage. We wouldn't have any kind of laws protecting gay people from discrimination. And of course there's some in some states and some not in others. But all of the advances we made were because of that first spark of GLF. Before that, with the annual Mattachine Society demonstration in Philadelphia, which I participated in 1968, they could not pay attention to us. The powers that be we were just this tiny, tiny little fringe group until we became not so tiny, and until we became so noisy and so much apart, and made alliances with other groups like the Black Panthers or the Young Lords, the women's movement, all of that, until we became very, very vocal and in your face, and not willing to say, "Oh, please, sir, may I have some, a little cookie, a little bit here and there." We weren't getting anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I want to backtrack a little bit to your participation in 1968 at those demonstrations, and just to remind us both, so I don't forget, I'd like to talk about the takeover of RAT.
Mm-hmm.
But let's back up first to 1968 and talk about what the demonstration in Philadelphia was like, how you felt about it, and what the difference is. What was the difference between that and when, post Stonewall
Right.
comes along?
Okay, so the idea about the demonstration in 1968, which wasn't the first one, but it was the only one that I went to. The men had to wear suits and ties, and the women had to wear skirts, which I absolutely loathed. It's not that I wouldn't wear a skirt to work or anything. It's just that I hated doing that for that particular day. And we marched around in a circle with our little picket signs that were all nicely printed. And we did that, and we made essentially no trouble, and various tourists who were visiting Independence Hall stood there licking their ice cream cones and taking pictures. I remember this young guy, I guess he was a teenager, with his parents, young teenager, staring at us and eating his ice cream. and people looking at us again like, we're some sort of weirdo display at the zoo. I thought I was not happy with the whole thing. I felt extremely uncomfortable, and not because they were staring at us that way, but because it just made me feel extremely ineffective, and that I was impersonating somebody that I wasn't. Subsequently, Gay Liberation Front, then it felt like I was being me. I was out there being me. I was being real. I wasn't pretending to be this nice middle-class person who just wanted to be part of middle-class society. And the truth was, I was already very radicalized. I already had been, from way back.
So I could see where it'd be very difficult to kind of put on this straight drag and walk around. Was Barbara Giddings involved?
Yes. Oh, yes. She and her lover, Kay Lahusen, had their own, essentially, organization with a little mimeograph machine. Franklin Kameny was there. A lot of the gay organizations at that point were two people and a mimeo machine.
It seems, though, in retrospect, it was very brave to be doing that at that time, right? In the early, mid-'60s coming.
I guess it was, yeah.
Right?
But you see, at that point, I was already a public person.
Right.
I want to skip ahead to the Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations.
Go ahead.
And that happened, I think it was in Philadelphia as well. Gay Liberation Front came as a delegation to that, a few of us. And also Daughters of Bilitis, and some various members of different organizations. We disrupted the whole thing. It was, the original ERCO, I think it was called, was very much a Robert Rules of Order kind of meeting of these different little organizations. We put in a proposal from Gay Liberation Front that we had certain planks. We wanted the freedom to have, freedom from oppression regarding our sexuality, freedom to ingest the drugs of one's choice, women's reproductive rights, including a right to abortion, anti-war stuff. I mean, we had a whole list, anti-racist stuff. We had a whole list of demands. This one guy, Craig, I think his last name was Schoonmaker, I'm not sure.
Schoonmaker?
I think so. Okay, he got up and made a speech. He was, I guess, had his own little organization of him and maybe one other guy who was his lover. He was very upset, particularly about the women's reproductive rights. As a gay man, I don't think he had a thing to say about it, except that he was Catholic, very Catholic. And somehow he had managed to think that it was okay to be Catholic and to be gay, but not okay to have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So sexual freedom for men, but forget about women. So he made this speech against abortion and how terrible what we wanted was. The two women who I knew who were representing Daughters of Bilitis, one of them was my ex-lover, and she was quite a bit older than me, 16 years older. And her current lover, who was about her own age, were really incensed because Allison, that was my ex, apparently had gotten raped and had an abortion when she was younger. And Marion, I don't think she ever was in that position, but boy, were they furious at Craig. They got up and made a speech. So at any rate, ERCO ended up passing the Gay Liberation Front platform.
ERCO, what does that stand for?
Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations.
Gotcha. And it's interesting that they passed with all of those provisions in it, given that I would imagine that some of the gay people there may have been pro the Vietnam War or
indifferent, really. It wasn't they were, a lot of them were just single issue people.
Right. Do you remember what year that was?
No, probably it would have had to be 1970 as my guess.
Okay, all right. Rat.
Okay.
What is, and if you could speak about what Rat magazine is for our listening crowd.
It was a newspaper. It was a, quote, underground newspaper. Of course, there wasn't anything underground the way the Samizdat in the Soviet Union was, in the old Soviet Union, because people sold it on the streets. And these were left-wing, alternate newspapers, like Come Out newspaper. And it had been a counterculture kind of thing. So it was a combination of counterculture and left politics, and pretty male-dominated. And the women who'd worked on there included people like Robin Morgan and Jane Alpert, and Carol Grossberg was, who later changed her name to Kali, K-A-L-I, and I forget the names of a lot of the others. But they decided that they wanted to put out a women's issue because they were tired of the sexism in the newspaper, which was pretty much the kind of sexism you would see in a lot of these newspapers or in Grove Press. The idea of free sex meaning basically looking at all women as sex objects, and you can screw as many as you want. So the idea was to put out a women's issue. I got a call from Robin asking me to join it, so I came and joined the group, and we put out the first newspaper, the women's issue. It was called RAT, Subterranean News, but we changed it to Women's Liberation, with R-A-T big letters and the rest smaller letters.
Women's Liberation. Okay, got you.
Right.
With Rat emphasized in
Right.
the liberation. Okay. Cute.
Okay. So we wrote articles about different things. There was articles by me, there was articles by Robin, articles by Jane. I did a cartoon page for it, for that first issue. And there was also articles. There was an article by this group, the Weather Underground Women. I never got to know them personally. I did not want to know who they were. It was Jane Weatherwoman and Susie Weatherwoman and whatever the names they chose, because the less I knew, the less anybody could get out of me when it came to them being hunted down.
Were you sympathetic to the Weather Underground?
I had mixed feelings about it, very mixed feelings. I understood their feelings about why they were doing what they were doing, and sometimes I questioned myself and said, do I have enough courage to go and blow things up in order to end the war? Well, I was young then to even think like that. But it wasn't the way I did things. I was a media person. I was a person who was out in public, not a person who would work underground to do something that you had to be very secretive about. And very, that just wasn't me. And I could understand their feelings about it, because we were busy torturing and blowing up people on the other side of the planet and killing their children and bombing their rice paddies and their water buffaloes and so on. And I could understand people being in such agony about it that they wanted to do whatever they could to stop it. And eventually we did stop it, ended the Vietnam War, but that wasn't the way it was stopped, though. And now that I'm quite a bit older, I think I still have some of those feelings of agony about what we're doing in different parts of the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, places in Africa, what we've done in Central and South America, and what we may end up doing back here if certain people get their way and make themselves president for life, people who believe in torture. I could just see something like that happening here, where people who are dissidents get rounded up, tortured, beaten, and so on. It can happen here.
Do you think this administration is beyond that? Do you think that we're going to get past this stress test for democracy?
I don't know. My crystal ball's in the shop.
But let's get back to RAT. I
Okay.
pulled you off.
All right, so I did work on that for a while. And then I think I got really more involved in working in the radio stuff with WBAI. One of the things that happened in RAT that really upset me, there was a young woman who was sort of a yippie type, who wasn't terribly political. She was just more into let's all have fun, and the revolution should be about let's having lots of fun. And Jane, Alpert, and Robin, and a couple other people decided she must be an agent because she's not that political. And so they purged her. And I thought that, and she was actually being my roommate at the time, and I thought that was pretty terrible. It was, I've seen that before, and I see it now, where people attack other people who are their peers, and because they're really paranoid about the FBI, which is a good thing to be. And so they would, there was another woman who got purged. That was up in Boston during that same period. And I went up there and I met with the woman who had purged her. And what they had done was they had taken her across state lines and interrogated her because they were convinced she was an agent. That basically, after that, she stopped being political at all. She was just really traumatized. But I said, do you know what you've done? You've kidnapped somebody across state lines. Do you know what the Lindbergh laws are? That's a capital offense. You idiots. If she'd been really an agent, you would be have your asses in prison. I was young then, but I was old enough to know that.
She didn't press charges or anything?
No, she just was so depressed and unhappy that people, had turned on her like that she just sort of dropped out politically.
I think that's in KJ's book as well. Interesting.
Another incident from that time, talk about agents and stuff. I was working on RAT, and this guy approached me and wanted to talk to me about action. So I went up to his apartment. It didn't strike me as the kind of thing where he, was a sexual thing, and it wasn't. He was talking to me about how we could put this poison in people's cigarettes and assassinate them, and he had this rifle that he showed me. He was like 22, and he wanted to get me involved in, some kind of assassination attempts. And what was going on in my mind was, agent, let me out of here. Red light. I got out of there and got away from that guy.
I was actually going to ask you if in the GLF there was any discussions of perhaps going the way of the weather people
No.
in terms of violence.
No.
Do you remember when the townhouse at East 11th Street, 18 East 11th Street blew up?
Yeah.
How you felt about that? What your thoughts were?
I was sad. I was just, that these people blew themselves up. It was a terrible thing. And I knew at that time that I did not know enough about anything having to do with weapons and things, and bombs and stuff, to even consider being involved with anything like that. I thought it was crazy.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring it up to the first march in Washington in 1979. Did you go?
No,
You didn't go.
no. I don't remember. Well, I might have, and I didn't. Let me think. Where was? No, I was on the West Coast. I
You-
had moved to the West Coast.
Where were you living?
Oakland, California.
What year did you move to Oakland?
October 74.
Were you involved in
Yes.
political groups there?
Oh, yeah. What happened was I had been involved in an affair that I don't want to talk about in any detail, except that my heart was broken and I felt like I had kind of worn out New York. I was very much a part of the women's movement and was hanging out with the various people who were kind of big shots in the women's movement, the Steinems and the people like that, and Kate Millett and whatever. And I remember going to parties where people would, like literary parties, and I'd walk around and talk to people, and I'd watch people who I was talking to looking over my shoulder to see who was more important that they wanted to talk to snag another book contract or whatever. And I felt very much like I was not really part of that scene and was just too minor a player to be considered important by them. And it wasn't about, it didn't feel like it was about friendship. It felt like it was about being the next big star in the movement. So I had been to the West Coast on more than one occasion and gotten to know some of the people at the Women's Press Collective, like Judy Grahn and Wendy Cadden and so on, and was talking about moving out there when I got on the phone and I talked to Judy Grahn and says, "Why don't you come here? We have a spare room in our collective house." Packed up and I went, and then became part of the Women's Press Collective.
At that, did you make forays into San Francisco while you were living in Oakland?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's right across the bridge.
Do you remember at all? Did you go to Maud's?
Yeah, I went there, I think once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
I was not a bar person.
Right. And what about the yearly marches / parades in San Francisco?
I would go to those.
And what was your sense of them? How did you feel about them at that point in the 70s still?
It was still a lot of fun for me in those days. I would march with one group or another. And I remember one of the times, in fact, let me think now. I think I marched with them off and on into the 90s. And I just had a good time. Once I was on the back of a motorcycle with a friend of mine who was part of the Dykes on Bikes. She was trying to encourage me to get into motorcycling. And she said, you don't mind taking chances. You're a brave person. I said, but I don't like being on a machine that makes a lot of noise where I'm breathing exhaust fumes on the highway. My idea of taking chances to have a good time is to take a backpack and go off by myself in the wilderness. I'd rather deal with the bears.
So you were in the Bay Area then during Harvey Milk.
Yeah.
Did you help with that campaign at all? Or
No.
What was your feeling about Milk and when he was elected and his positions and so on?
I was supportive. I wasn't in San Francisco, so I couldn't vote for him.
Yeah.
But I thought it was, he was a pretty good guy. And at that point, again, what year do you remember that he got elected?
Hey, David, could you Google what year Harvey Milk got elected? Because he's killed in, I believe it's in '77. I think he was killed the same year he was elected. I don't think it was lots and lots of time that he was actually in position. And then the manslaughter charge happens in. We'll find out. We'll find out from him. In the meantime,
What's the date? What do you want now?
when Harvey Milk was elected to District 5 in San Francisco, where I lived after, like in 1980, 81. Were you still in the Bay Area then?
Oh yeah,
Oh, okay.
I stayed in the Bay Area until 2005, except for 1 year when I was living out in the countryside, up in a little tiny town. Me and my lover and 500 fundamentalists or something.
Oh, good Lord, have mercy. What was your? Did you?
I made friends with them.
You did?
Oh yeah. My best friends here in Portland are a couple of fundamentalists who live next door.
Really?
Yeah, they've gotten pretty relaxed about gay stuff, and the only way you get to change people's minds is to, I mean, for those people whose minds can be changed, is to get to know them and they get to know you.
I absolutely agree. I feel like the gay revolution is other people figuring out, oh gosh, I don't hate this person. This isn't so weird.
Yeah, and I don't even think they had that kind of hate in them. They were just very loving, kind people. I teach the two little girls martial arts.
Do you?
Yeah.
It's an interesting time. Your best friends are religious fundamentalists, and they live next door.
Yeah, we share. We've shared the chickens and the produce, and when when the mother got pregnant again, and was having a hard time, I was cooking for her. We're neighbors. We look after each other.
Nice, very nice. When Harvey was killed, were you part of that candlelight vigil that went up Market Street? No. And the protests that happened with the verdict for Dan White, what was your sense at that time?
I was outraged. Now again, that was happening in San Francisco, and I was very, very involved with stuff in the East Bay. We were having a big uproar in the women's movement there, so that kind of was my focus.
What was the uproar in the women's movement?
This was okay. The Women's Press Collective was always struggling economically. It basically depended for survival not just on book sales, which was what we did, but on donations, and it was constantly, like a lot of these little small presses and little women's organizations, dependent on donations and free labor. And the women who'd started it, Judy Grahn and her lover Wendy Cadden, were tired. They were exhausted. Now you can get Judy's story too, which is another story. But and she and I have some disagreements about that. There were women who ran an organization called the Feminist Women's Health Center. And what it did was it provided women's exams and also abortions. And they were making money hand over fist, because when you need abortion, you do not, you need that abortion. Buying a book of poetry is optional. People will risk their lives and die in order to get that abortion when they need it. And they will pay money. And so the Feminist Women's Health Center, which was one of the big abortion providers in the Bay Area in those days, was, doing okay. The women who ran that got together with some women in Detroit who ran a credit union. And again, people need to have a credit union, like a bank. They don't lose money. They're making, they can lose money, but for the most part, they did okay. And so the idea was they were going to combine forces and build this thing called the Feminist Economic Network. and it would be this big capitalist organization that would make money for women's causes, except it wouldn't be a non-profit. It would be a thing that would make women rich, right? They talked Judy and Wendy into joining this thing. Wendy was originally really against it because she came from a socialist family, but she got talked into it because, she was exhausted too. When I found out about it, I was pretty horrified because I went and talked to a lot of other people, and it was essentially the end of the Women's Press Collective at that point because we all split, and the Feminist Economic Network went down. What they had done in Detroit was taken out a bunch of loans from, these women had taken out loans from the credit union in order to buy a women's building. Had been the Detroit Women's City Club, and it had been, I guess, unused for a while. So they took out, I don't know how many $100,000 to buy the building, but they took it from, it was illegal to take that from the credit union because this was everybody's little money that they put in, and it should not have been given out in loans to 8 different people who weren't even qualified to have these kinds of large loans. One of them was a woman on welfare. She just signed for it. So the idea was, using this essentially illegal act. And not that I have anything against illegal acts. I was doing illegal acts when I was young and gay.
Right.
Just being gay.
Right on.
But what it meant was that a woman who was a member of the credit union couldn't get a loan to buy a bicycle or anything that she needed because all the money was tied up in this thing. That was in Detroit. The whole thing crashed down because somebody, one of the people who had organized the thing, was cheated on by her lover and then went and reported the whole business to the federal organization that monitors credit unions. So when the thing crashed, the women who had organized it blamed all of these, quote, downwardly mobile dykes who sabotaged what was going to be this great project, and they grabbed all of the fancy furniture that they had bought for the women's building, stuffed it into a couple of big giant U-Hauls, and took off to California with it. Judy and I had a big falling out over that thing and didn't talk to each other for years, and now of course we're friends again, but that's how these things go.
Time heals.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of your 6 o'clock appointment, so let me just ask you, that's not right.
It's close to right. If you'll hold on a second, I'll find out what's right.
David, what time is it?
No, here we go, 5:56.
Okay.
77.
1977, Harvey Milk was elected. Then let me finish it out with just asking you, how do you feel about where gay rights are right now? How do you feel about the ever-increasing acronym LGBTQRXYZ?
Okay.
And what do you think about the idea that in that spectrum thing that gets bigger and bigger, of the idea that lesbians have been erased? Or do you disagree with that?
Oh, okay. I agree with it. I think that there's a lot of stuff happening, and it's, I think, mostly the result of a certain very small number of people who call themselves trans activists, who, as far as I can tell, really hate women. Let me give you an example. And this, the majority, all of the transsexual people I've met seem like perfectly nice people to me. However, there is this group. What happened was recently in San Francisco at the Dyke March, or before the Dyke March, there was a display at the public library of these transsexual people put on, and it was like weapons, baseball bats and things like that, painted pink or something, that was supposedly going to be used to beat up TERFs. TERFs meaning trans-exclusive radical feminists. In other words, what they're doing is they're attacking women, and they're attacking specifically lesbians who wanted to have like women-only spaces that did not include transsexuals, people born male who put on skirts but haven't even done any physical changes. And God knows women have fought hard to get some space of our own. If people want to have a women's space like the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which is closed down now because of all of this controversy, that doesn't include some other people, why not? When the Black Million Man March happened in Washington, D.C., you didn't see anybody who was not white showing up. And women didn't show up either, including black women. Because if they had, they would have been beat up. And these particular small group of trans people who've been dominating a lot of, not the discussion in the news, because that's a whole different thing, but a lot of this fighting below the major news conference stuff that's going on. Like they had a T-shirt that was on display at the library. It had like a big blood splash, and it said "I punch TERFs." In other words, threatening violence against women who disagree with them or want separate space. To me, this is kind of nuts, and it's very much a macho violence thing. And I don't care if these people now decide that they're women; they're not acting like, in any way that I can support.
TERF is TERF.
F, right.
Would the women's only spaces be open to trans women who have had
that I don't know, because I haven't been a part of that.
No.
But I would imagine that they would. I mean, if somebody's had surgery. So there's that. Where we stand in terms of the movement as a whole and gay rights, I'd say we're in danger right now. And I'd say that has to do with the Trump administration and Mr. Mike Pence waiting in the wings.
You think same-sex equality could be rolled back?
Oh, yeah. Look what happened in Germany in the 30s. There is a Jewish saying that I don't remember where I heard it, but I remember it. In every generation, a new Pharaoh arises to oppress us. In every generation, we have to fight back.
It's an interesting one with Donald Trump within the Jewish religion, because there's so many who feel that he's the best friend Israel has ever had.
Oi, that's my response. Him with this bunch of anti-Semites in his organization, or among his pals. He's maybe the best friend that the extreme right in Israel has, but I don't see him as a best friend to Judaism at all. And it's the kind of situation where but where I see Israel going is, instead of making peace with the people who are their neighbors, relying more and more on violence. Now they're making peace with the Saudi Arabians. They're making a deal. The Saudi Arabians are busy massacring the Yemenites. They're busy, their way of treating anybody who is female is not what I'd call something I'd want to ally myself with. It seems to be let's make a deal with oligarchs and right-wing dictators. Sorry, I'm not for it. That's totally against any kind of liberation.
And let's stop at that.
Okay.